All right, so again, there will be no opening statements, but it is important that I introduce each of our esteemed guests. To my immediate right is Maya Iverbach, a Yale graduate and a freelance journalist based in Mexico City. Her recent and compelling work has been published in a number of national media outlets. I would especially advise you to check out her 2018 piece, Finding a Way to America, that was published in the Washington Post in November, that chronicles one family's journey from Honduras to the United States and the many harrowing moments along the way. It's captivating. It's accompanied by a number of wonderful photographs and multimedia aids, and I think you will all benefit from checking that out. Next, Del Garcia comes to us from Austin, Texas. She works for the Migration Clinicians Network and focuses on providing health justice for the mobile poor. In her 25 plus years of experience, she has developed a number of programs for MCN, including the important work that transferred health records from migrants with chronic or infectious diseases. I'm looking forward to hearing her perspective on these topics as well. Next, Andrea Gittleman works for the Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide for the U.S. Holocaust Museum in D.C. She currently focuses on policy outreach and accountability efforts, and she's applying her experience with the Burma Lawyers Council by directing the Holocaust Center's ongoing efforts to investigate what's going on in Burma and Myanmar. She holds a JD from the NYU School of Law and serves as an inspiration, I think, for undergraduates everywhere as a Peace Corps alumna. Lastly, Stephen Rubin joins us from Penn State, where he's currently an associate professor of art. Before entering academia, he was a photojournalist whose photographs were published in just about any major American publication you might imagine, and a slew of international ones to boot. He has worked extensively with the Open Society Foundations, developing a number of projects and using his award-winning photography to expose the inhumane conditions the U.S. government places upon immigrants. Additionally, he worked for the Open Society Foundation to develop a project that provided photography, therapy, and photography instruction to survivors of torture. I think all of our panelists will have many instructive things to say, and hopefully we can have a excellent conversation. So, as with many CWA panels, the topic and the title is broad. If you read the description, the basket of potential issues we could discuss is even broader. But I thought we may start more humbly, thinking about ways we could become better informed before launching into more of the ambitious discussions that may follow. And as such, I wanted to float to the panel a question about misconceptions and misperceptions. And I hope they would draw from their career expertise to speak to what they feel to be the most problematic misconception in our understanding of the treatment of migrants and refugees. So the floor is yours.
Hi, my name is Maya Iverbach. I'm a journalist based in Mexico. I would say a lot of the misconceptions in the news at this point have to do with the idea that migrants are gaming the system, that people are trying to subvert immigration laws, take advantage of immigration laws. And what I would say is that instead migration has adapted in recent years to fit the laws that are in place. That as we've seen sort of restrictions to the number of refugees who are allowed to come here through refugee resettlement programs, as there's been fluctuations to the ways that people are allowed to come on temporary work permits, or other ways in which people can come to the country, that the fact that families are coming now into an asylum system that's based off of the fact that they have to be on U.S. territory to prevent being deported immediately to where they're from, is a way that migration has adapted rather than that individuals have taken advantage of the system. And also, I've spent a lot of time last year traveling with many of the migrant caravans, which were depicted, I think, as a sort of large standoff between the government and immigrants. And yet, it's very hard to get information about U.S. law and policy about the specifics of it, about the exact ways in which the government is attempting to restrict immigration when you are traveling by foot, perhaps, or traveling by bus through many different states that you don't know at all. And a lot of the information that people get are from relatives, from friends, from Facebook, from WhatsApp, which is a messaging service like iMessage. And that information sometimes is just as simple as, do you know people who have managed to get to the US, who have managed to get to their families, be it in California or Texas or New York or some other state? And if you know enough people who have managed to do that, if you are in a situation, perhaps when you're not under immediate threat, that perhaps there is no immediate gun to your head, but your life situation is precarious, it sometimes makes sense to either travel on your own in something like a caravan, or if you can borrow money or mortgage your house or put up your land to pay several $1,000s to be smuggled. And there's an extreme criminalization, I think, in the American conception of what that smuggling is. But to give just one example, a friend of mine was in Huehuetenango, which is on the border of Guatemala and Mexico, a couple weeks ago, and the person who was a recruiter for the coyotes, for the smugglers, was also a primary school teacher. And so it's people who are members of your community who are also having a conversation about what are the conditions you're living in, can you support your family, is there anyone to receive you in the US, and can your family help you come up with whatever it is, $5,000, $7,000, that in the long run is going to help you have a better life in the US. Without much of a conception of the fact that most people who are Central American who come to the US, probably 4 out of 5, if not more, will end up not winning their asylum case. And so I think it remains to be seen in the coming years how that will affect people's decisions over whether to come. And also it will depend what portion of people end up being deported and targeted for deportation.
And I think another misconception that is now being fed actively is the level of sort of criminal presence in immigrant populations, and the fact that they come to this country to then engage in greater criminal activity. And I think if you look at how the policies have changed based on that whole notion that you can somehow deter, then the greater focus has been on interdiction. What you see foreign policy from the U.S. coming to other countries being, mano duro, that you need to just sort of crack down. It has to be law enforcement. And yet in reality, what you can see is that if you look at statistics in this country, native-born individuals commit twice as many crimes as undocumented folks, and certainly 3 times as many crimes as legal immigrants to this country. So when you look at what is being done in terms of characterizations, then that really is untrue. And when you talk about the effectiveness of what's being applied, then you need only look at these other countries to really say, if you focus on law enforcement and you essentially criminalize poverty, then you are in no way going to make the situation better. And yet rarely do we have a conversation about what the policies of the United States are and their effect. And rarely do we talk about just a general within the world, and certainly from the U.S. to other places, a discussion and sort of a normalization of violence, of the presence of guns, of the diminishing of the effect and the importance and the presence of human trafficking. And when all of those things are normalized, when huge numbers of people being shot in a single setting, when human trafficking of people of all ages, men and women, is seen as just an unfortunate but a normal part of life, then I think it's going to be really impossible for us to say that there will be something that can positively affect immigration in the way that seems to be so off-putting to people in this country as we look at what's going on truly between the U.S. and other parts of the world.
Yeah, thank you. So just to build off of misperceptions, I think something that we often forget is that when we see these large migration flows or an influx of refugees, it means that people are fleeing something really awful. So I work at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., as was said, but I work specifically on modern-day mass atrocity situations. So when people talk about Syrian refugees in Europe, I feel like what's missing from that conversation is what is happening in Syria. So we see migration as a problem to be solved, but really the major problem to be solved is the mass violence and targeting of civilians that's happening in too many places around the world, whether it's in Latin America or in places like Syria, Burma, Myanmar today. I mean, there's no shortage of places where civilians are being targeted and where people are fleeing for their lives. I think a misperception when we think about that kind of violence is just that, you know, the world is a brutal place, mass violence happens. That's not the case at all. I think that's a serious misperception. When communities are being targeted, if minorities are being killed because of their identity, that is a purposeful act, that is a crime. The perpetrators have decided to engage in that kind of criminal behavior because they think it helps them. They think that it'll help them in some way to act in such a criminal way. So that means, that's the bad news. The good news is that those kinds of crimes are preventable. And so if we are concerned about refugee flows, about people, about entire families being uprooted and coming to a new place, we should be equally concerned about the importance of preventing mass atrocities in places. And I feel like there's kind of a misperception in terms of our foreign policy and perhaps a misapplication of our priorities. When we see what's happening in Syria today, for example, and there really aren't that many good options because crimes are underway and have been for quite some time. But there might have been more options if we had more of a preventive mindset, if we had prioritized the protection of civilians, of human rights, of the protection of minorities, then we could have had more preventative efforts that could have stemmed crimes against humanity and could have stemmed global migration as well.
So one area of misconception, confusion that I'd like to just mention really has to do with, I think, some of the language that we use. Just even the terms refugees as opposed to migrants. And I know that the distinction really comes out of refugee law, where basically a refugee is someone who's fleeing persecution, right, of a variety of sorts. Whereas a migrant is more typically someone who is searching for a better life, is trying to better themselves or their family, is really coming for economic reasons, right? So that's the basic distinction in terms of, and it's very relevant in terms of asylum law. But I think that really doesn't get into the complexity of it. So for example, one of the places in the world where I've worked is in Western Burma, where there's an ethnic group in the far west state. It's called Chin State, as in like chin. Like these people really do take it on the chin, I'm afraid. But so it's one of the poorest states in Burma. It's also one of the most persecuted, and it's actually, in spite of that, it's gotten very little media attention. So for the Chin, I mean, there's been kind of horrific human rights violations, partly because of their ethnic group, because they're not the dominant Burmese ethnic group, partly because of their religion. They're Christian and not Buddhist. It seems that the dominant Buddhist ethnic group never quite got the message that Buddhism is sort of about like not harming any living thing. I don't know, they sort of missed that lesson, but anyway, so they're very persecuted because of their religion. So that's led to a lot of their fleeing into northeast India, which is an area that actually, it's basically the British came along and sort of divided that area, because the people in this area of northeast India called the Mizos are really by ancestry brothers and sisters with the Chin, but there's been an international border artificially constructed that's divided them. So the Chin are, the Mizos are Christian, and so in many ways they have so much in common, and yet they're also very persecuted within India. And also there are no NGOs there. There's very little government support. UNHCR isn't even in there. But in any event, they come partly because they're fleeing persecution as refugees, but they also come for economic reasons, because they're fleeing the poorest state in Burma. And yet those economic reasons are also influenced by the persecution, right? So it's not just a simple matter of dividing economic from sort of political, religious persecution. If your state is mistreated by the national government and all of the kind of religious and political pieces that are kind of putting your state down, and it becomes the poorest state also, then you flee partly for economic reasons, but also because as a consequence of these other things that have preceded it. So I think it's important, for our understanding to recognize some of that complexity, and it certainly applies to a lot of the folks coming up from Central America as well, right? It's not just a simple matter of they're trying to get a better job somewhere.
Can I add one thing?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And like I said, crimes against humanity and mass atrocities are not accidental. They're purposeful. Poverty is not accidental either. So when a minority group like the Chin, for example, in Burma or other minorities in lots of the world, if they are in economic distress, that also is not an accident. And often we see connections between groups who are cut off from, finding ways to participate in the economy, finding ways to pursue livelihoods. And we find connections between that and groups that are targeted for persecution and mass violence as well.
And those groups that are targeting then look at the structures that they can control and they can modify, and do so in such a way that then the structures are really quite violent against people. And that's the place where then the system becomes much, much harder to break down, because we've now allowed multiple changes. In other words, this country has watched the treatment of individuals through its own immigration processes really become quite violent. And while people have wrung their hands and been quite distressed, better than 2,600 children were separated from their family at the border. So the systems that we are malforming now and modifying, that are being modified by others to suit their particular political agenda, are perpetrating a level of violence that's going to be very difficult to undo.
Okay, thank you. So my next question comes from a consensus I gather from my students. And sometimes when we talk about these big issues of refugees and migration, they feel a frustration that if we take too much of a bird's eye view, we dehumanize the migrants and we dehumanize the refugee experience. So I would ask the panel to explain how in their work they maintain a sense of humanity and they respect the dignity of the individuals and groups that they encounter. Would any of you be willing to address that?
I would say that I think this is a question I pose to myself, I think, more than something that I've resolved. I think sometimes it's very hard for a reader, let's say in the US, to understand the degree of violence that people are facing. And I think that sometimes we have to describe things that are smaller than the ultimate violence in order to have people understand them. So for someone who has had a family member killed, that's an important part of the story that you might tell about them, about why they are fleeing. But it's also important then to talk about, I think, what are the sort of emotional consequences that has left for them, the ways that they break down talking about it. What are the physical things that happen to their body, whether that means that the elderly in their families have then gone through additional health issues, whether they go into moments of shock when there are other additional emotional traumas. I think sometimes I was trying to write about Haitian immigrants who ended up in Tijuana, and the thing that the family kept telling me was that it was so distressing that when they arrived, their teenager had to go for surgery because one of his toenails was going to fall off and had become infected. His toe had become infected because of all the walking he had done. And I sometimes feel like it's easier to explain to someone here something of that scale than it is to explain what it is to have a family member be killed. And so I try to include some of those details in the stories that I'm telling about people. And also to try to talk about what it means across various generations. So I wrote about a woman who is the caretaker of her nephews because her sister disappeared while trying to migrate to the US 10 years ago. And while there's a story to be written about that sister's disappearance and what it is that makes people disappear when they try to travel through areas in northern Mexico that are often controlled by cartels that are incredibly dangerous for, I think, young women especially, because they might be forced into different types of labor, forced into sex work, or killed. That there's also a story to be told about the way that her sister understood it and what happened to their mother as they tried to hold the family together, and what happened to those kids who had sort of a confusion growing up about who to call their mother, whether it was their aunt or whether there's their mother, and had a certain degree of shame around the language that they were using to talk about their family. And I think that trying to chronicle those secondary or tertiary impacts of a lot of the very brutal things that happen in migration processes and that happen over the course of many years are like sort of valuable component of trying to help people relate to people who are migrating.
And I think that for myself, what I have chosen to do is to not look away and to step in. That if, I've gotten to an age where originally in 2016, I thought I was on a really slick road to retirement. And then in 2017, whoa, is that wrong? And so here we are in 2019, where I need to be mindful. I need to educate myself always. I need to think about my language and the wording that I use and the things that I say and the way that I express myself and represent myself, and that I understand truly the horror that has been visited on people, and not just be so consumed that I can't act, but that I look for ways where I can have an effect. So while I cannot change immigration law, if I know that someone is being detained and that they are having a health crisis and they need help, I will find a doc who will review those medical records and write a letter of declaration to support their attorney so that they can ask for the person to be bonded out. One person at a time. Very slow going, I get it. But that is the level of success that I can at least generate on my own, and I have to keep doing that. And I have to keep representing that to the young people that I work with. I have a very young team that works with me. One of them is was a DACA student. The day he went to have his DACA renewed, the entire office, I think, was frozen with fear that he would not come back. And we have a young man who was Cuban, and his wife is going through the process, and there's no guarantee that that will happen. And so it is to say to them that we are here for you to have a professional job where your work is honored, where we sustain you, and where you are sustaining us. And that we need to see the level of moral injury that's being visited on all of the people with whom we work, and that we need to generate something that creates moral fuel, and that we buoy them up in as many ways as we can.
Yeah. Tough to follow. I think respecting dignity is in the core of everything that's being talked about here. Thinking in particular about victims and survivors of crimes against humanity and mass atrocities, I think for people working in policy circles like I do, people who work in Washington, we often think, if people knew what was happening in South Sudan, if they knew what was happening in Burma and Syria, then we would act. And so we work with people who have undergone such trauma and have them tell their story and then tell it again and again and again. And that could be useful in terms of promoting policy change. It could be re-traumatizing to that individual. I think a good practice is to make sure that victims and survivors own their stories and control how it's being used. And I think it's incumbent upon people who do this kind of policy work or educational outreach to make sure that we adopt a trauma-sensitive approach, working with counselors. We wouldn't want to keep anyone from telling their story because we are too afraid, but giving people the tools and the resources required for them to make that decision on their own behalf. And something that was mentioned before about kind of respecting the humanity and understanding families and finding these connections between people. We had a pretty interesting exhibit at the Holocaust Museum, which is no longer there. It was a temporary thing, but it was a portal, an actual shipping container, a big shipping container that people would go into the Holocaust Museum. And at the end of it, at the short end, was a video screen, and it was connected to refugee camps in Turkey, in Jordan, and one in Germany, where there were Syrian refugees. And so people visiting the Holocaust Museum would have a live conversation with Syrian refugees. And they wouldn't talk about, what's happening in Syria. Teenagers in Washington would talk to teenagers from Syria about music. We had a Holocaust survivor, several Holocaust survivors, speak with Syrian survivors across a big divide in terms of generation and time. And that, I think, really humanized the story for a lot of people. You can find a connection with, a high school student who's on a class trip to DC and is going to visit all the museums, to a high school student who's now in Turkey displaced from his home. So that, I think, is something pretty unique. That, of course, can't be done everywhere, but I think if we remember those points of connection, a Syrian refugee is not just a Syrian refugee, they are a music lover, they are an artist, they are so many different things, and finding ways to find those points of contact between otherwise different people, I think, is really important.
Yeah.
That's great. So I think I'm thinking here about, I think some of, like Maya, some of the work that you've done, and just these really powerful stories where you're addressing a larger issue, but you're telling that story through like a focused approach to like zeroing in on an individual, or maybe that individual in their family, right? So that kind of approach, I think, communicates to people a level of understanding and a level of feeling that just looking at it from from that sort of bird's eye view, looking at numbers, just never reaches there, right? So I think that's as photographers, that's often the approach we try to take too, right? We tell a larger story by focusing on a really compelling individual or their family, and that's the approach I've always tried to take. But I do think there are risks, like Andrea's pointing out, that people, in trying to kind of respect people's humanity, or trying to do good and trying to do well with your reporting or your photographing, that you can actually do harm as well to the people that you're photographing or reporting on. So to try to sort of to identify with them and think of them in terms of their circumstance, and try to protect them at some level too, right? Especially people who are in this process of travel. It's not necessarily the pictures that you would most want to be seen by the world, right? Or sometimes pictures of yourself in your worst moment, right? As a photographer, that's a powerful image. You want to convey that, you want to tell that story, but for that person, it's not always best thing for them. So I think by always being mindful of that and trying to help get people to really be okay. Is this really okay to use this photograph? Are you really okay with my revealing this to others? Do you understand what that really might mean? It's not just going to like a little local newspaper somewhere, someplace, it doesn't really matter, but it could, because of the World Wide Web, it can travel anywhere. You could have potential repercussions to you and your family. So just, I think by trying to kind of stay in touch with that concern, I think it keeps their humanity present. And I think it's all something we all need to keep in mind.
Yeah, can I ask a follow-up? I was wondering if you could elaborate on the relationship between documentation of the migrant or refugee experience or mass atrocity, crimes against humanity, the relationship between that information and accountability. How do you grapple with that in your work? And I think this may be most directed to Andrea, but any of you could certainly answer it.
Sure. I'm happy to start. This is something we think about a lot, if we think about the Holocaust, very little, there was some information coming out, but I think it was after the Holocaust that people saw what had happened, and that's when the justice process started. It's a bit different now when we all have access to documentation, to news stories, to photographs of places around the world where crimes against humanity, mass violence are taking place. Those barriers to accessing information are much lower now. And I think maybe years ago we had this idea that if you do the documentation, if you get the information out there, then there will be policy change that would respect migrants, that will respect refugees, people fleeing different situations, or maybe that we would have a greater interest in avoiding mass conflict to begin with. I think what we're seeing is that causal arrow isn't really there. It could be more of a dotted line. So I think documentation is still important, especially when it comes to accountability, but it's not necessary. There's so much documentation, for example, in Syria, and accountability still remains fleeting. And when we think about local avenues to justice, it's really important for people communities who have been so directly affected by crimes to see justice happen within their communities. But that's often very hard if the very perpetrators who committed these crimes are still in power. So it's hard to have that kind of a reckoning of a truth-seeking exercise or whatever the appropriate justice mechanism might be for that community. It's hard to do if the perpetrators are still in control. It's often difficult if internationally there's little political will in promoting justice and accountability. If locally it's not an avenue, internationally there are many roadblocks as well. When we're thinking about foreign policy regarding a particular country, how do we prioritize justice for victims and survivors of mass atrocities? I would argue that should be of paramount importance, but too often it's not. And so I think we have a great deal of work ahead of us, not only to promote local avenues to justice that can be led by victims and survivors in their own communities, but also making sure that people internationally are prioritizing justice and accountability. They have the documentation, we have the institutions, we have the tools, we just need the political will to make it happen.
And yet I think we have an enormous number of examples, even in very recent history in small numbers and for large groups, where there is documentation, the atrocity is known, and the amount of outrage is minuscule. And that it is even now a moment for debate. Well, the situation is such that maybe that was warranted, is now such a typical conversation that I am somewhat lost frequently about, because I find that personally, morally, so disorienting that I'm not even quite sure how to marshal my thoughts anymore. In terms of, someone arriving at their own embassy and being dismembered while still alive, and it being audio taped, and yet what we need to do is look at the country responsible for that and say, well, yes, but our economic interests are such that we really need to be careful. That's a tough one, and yet we are hearing that, and we are seeing that every day in this country, our own political decisions. And I'm not quite sure where you go then.
I would also say that sometimes in very good-hearted efforts to have accountability, that our definition of who counts as a victim is rather narrow, that we will really, people will go out and march for the 3-year-old who was separated from his mother, which is a major grievance, but nobody will pay much attention to hundreds of thousands of people who, if temporary protected status is taken away, could stand to be deported back to countries they haven't been to in 20 years. That the issue of deportations has sort of fallen off the map while migrant caravans have been front page. And I apologize, I wrote the migrant caravan news, I think it's important, but there's also a somewhat imbalance based off of what is the most visual harm. And I think then we also forget about, ways that we can talk about more structural harms. I think that the question that you raised about the difference, the way we try to categorize people as either refugees or not, or economic migrants or not, means that the systems that are in place are really ready to write off anyone who is fleeing for economic reasons. And yet if you talk to someone who is trying to take care of their families, they will say things like, this could get so much worse, right? If I don't provide, one father said to me at one point, if I don't provide for my 13-year-old kid, I'm in an area in Honduras where he can't finish high school. And if he can't finish high school and he's just stuck in my neighborhood, it's totally likely that he'll end up recruited by our local gang. And then the burden is on him, then he's the criminal and he's the perpetrator and he's the person from which people will be fleeing. And so if I don't have a way out now, what is going to happen to my children? And I've interviewed people like that. I spent a year following around a family that 2 of the kids used to be in the gangs, and they were recruited when they were 13 and 14. And they came from a family that was really troubled, where their mother was forced into marriage when she was around 16 because she had to move to a city and be like a home worker and live in someone's home and clean their house, which is a form of economic violence that the state doesn't prevent. And at the point that she's forced into marriage, the state also does not intervene. She has no recourse. And these children grew up in an abusive home and eventually joined the gang. And again, when they're 14, they're considered victims. At the point that they're 18, they're considered criminals and the scourge that the US would like to eliminate and would like to prevent from coming to the US. And I think that that's a very arbitrary line, right? What's the difference between someone who's 17 and a half and someone who's 18 and a half? And you know, how much should the burden be placed on that person? How much should it be placed on the state? And how much is there also to be discussed, like international policies, like the deportation of people who were undocumented Salvadoran immigrants in the 80s and 90s in the US who became, because of, in part, lack of integration, part of gangs who were then just systematically deported. How much is the US then responsible for things like the gang problems in Central America, where now it says, okay, this 18-year-old person is the person everyone is fleeing from. We have no responsibility to him. The state doesn't have a responsibility to him. Let him go to jail.
Just briefly, I'm thinking about this idea of documentation, and the documentation that's done by photographers, whether from somewhere else or occasionally also sort of within a country, the documentation by human rights observers, by human rights researchers, by health workers, that at least when it comes certainly to the visual aspect of it, thinking about the photograph as being some kind of a record, some kind of something close to a factual record. The reality is that photographs today can be easily dismissed. Just because people can make claims that they're fake news, that they've been doctored, that the pixels have been moved, that they've been invented, that someone has Photoshop skills and can rearrange things. So the value of the work that people do on this can be all too easily dismissed, and that's, I think, an extra challenge that journalists face and human rights workers face, and anybody really working in this field has to contend with. It makes the work that much more difficult.
And just finally, I would think that, when we talk about due process and following the letter of the law, and that seems to be so important in this country, I think if any of you sat one day in federal immigration court, you would really understand what a joke in many ways it is. I was in Laredo and spent from 9 in the morning to 10:30 in the morning in immigration court, and 271 people were processed in 3 groups. 4 people deep in an arc with headphones on, being translated to in Spanish, many of them who only spoke indigenous languages. And the judge sat there, and every single person was asked their name, gave their name. Do they understand why they were in court? Every person said yes, 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 yes. Looking to the person to their right who had just said yes, hears their name, they go yes. They look to this one says yes. So they spent this entire time, do you know why you're here? Do you understand why you've come? Have you spoken to your attorney that they spoke to for 30 minutes before the start of court? Are they voluntarily determining that they will leave the country? Yes, 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 yes. And then 271 people had to say why they were guilty. I'm guilty for walking across the river. I'm guilty for swimming across the river. I'm guilty for taking an inner tube across the river. And then all of them were pronounced guilty, and everybody was removed with one hand shackled to their waist and in leg irons. And that was 10:30 in the morning. So when we talk about, oh yes, due process is being observed, no. And I think we also need to inform ourselves about what's going on in our name through these court systems.
Thank you. That provides a nice segue for my penultimate question. We will get to yours, and I see many questions coming in about climate change and the impact on migration and mass violence. But I would ask, and Stevens hinted at this, Dell just hinted at it or spoke directly to it, in what ways are the existing national laws and international norms, protocols, conventions inadequate for dealing with the problems we face in 2019? And in what ways would you like to see an overhaul of this system? Small question.
Just as a statement, I mean, I don't think we could say wholesale they're all inadequate. They're just inadequately applied. So from there, then.
Yeah, and that was actually part of it. Is it application? Is it vocabulary? Is it jurisdictional? Where are we falling short, and where can we improve?
I mean, I feel like ideally, at a time when there is, it's hard to measure, right? But there are, the UN will argue, for example, that there's more displacement now than ever before. Questionable, like you can argue that, but if we take that at face value, theoretically there would be a system by which, if you are being forced out of your own country, that you can appeal to an international body and in a short period of time go to another country and then seek assistance there to reintegrate. And instead, I think the system that we have at hand is very focused on its own limitations and the points at which it can no longer handle the amount of immigrants. And it's, so we use a language that is about breaking points and crises and backlash, which sometimes happens. Like, I think if we look at what happened in Germany, there was a backlash. If we look at what happens in the US, there is a backlash. But that also is partly a consequence of a system not adapting to what is a contemporary situation in the world, which is that people have more means to try to imagine that they would go and live elsewhere in the world. That in that place they might also be displaced once again and, have to move to another country. But that I think some 1% of the people who are currently displaced in the world have been able to go through a formal refugee resettlement process. And so what happens to the other 99%? And I think we're thinking on very small scales at the moment.
I think that's a good point. And just to build off of that, if we think about not only refugee law, but I think the practice of the humanitarian assistance that goes into refugee camps. Refugee law, it was imagined that people would need to escape their home for a temporary period of time, and that at one point they would be able to return. And I think in so many places you're seeing protracted crises. The example of Burma, Myanmar came up. The Rohingya, just south of Chin State and Rakhine State, in that same country, of course, were forced out. Almost 900,000 of them. The vast majority of the population was forced out by acts of mass killing and crimes that the Holocaust Museum have determined to be a genocide. They're now in Bangladesh. They're living in this huge campus, now the biggest refugee camp in the world, with bamboo structures. There's some work that's being done now to make them a bit more permanent. But the Bangladeshi government, as you might imagine, does not want to just accept almost 1 million new people and allow them to stay and to thrive and to be a part of their community. They imagine that they will be able to go back. But if you know what's happening on the other side of the border where they came, the very same military who killed their family members and forced them to flee are still present, are still there. They're not going to go back anytime soon. And so you have this law that's designed for situations that aren't really reflected today. Resettlement, as was mentioned, is an option for a sliver of people. What happens when people are forced from their homes with no other place to go, and whether they're unwanted in their home country and unwanted in the new place where they go? How do our policies respond if the law hasn't adapted? And I would say, in terms of the law, as was said by Del earlier, the law's there, and policies are there, but it's not often applied. And I think there's often a failure of imagination, of creativity, and how to really provide solutions for some of the world's most vulnerable people. The Genocide Convention, again, genocide is a very rare crime. It's a very small segment of kind of the violence that we're talking about today. But the U.S. is a party to the Genocide Convention. We have the obligation to prevent and punish genocide. But then what does that mean? The convention doesn't say you must do X, Y, and Z. So it's up to us, it's up to our leaders and our policymakers to give meaning to those policies. And I think that's where all of us come in, trying to make sure that we are giving meaning to our legal obligations. The obligation's there. I think we need to be creative and humane in terms of how we're applying those kinds of laws.
I wonder sometimes how many Americans, or I should say maybe people who are born in America, would be willing to walk, let's say, 1,000 miles for a better life. Right? I don't think too many. So I would say that the people who do that, we need their strength, right, in this country. We need their determination. And that might sound flippant or, a pipe dream, but I think there's something to be said for that. And that maybe some of our laws should reflect that shift in vision. Yeah.
And I think a basic point of debate that is not raised, but seems to be driving so much of the conversation, is who deserves to be protected and who deserves access to protection of law and who deserves, and that we can make a distinction on who deserves, thank you for that word, between who is deserving and who is not deserving. I can look someone in the face and say, you do not deserve to live in safety and freedom and protection. And yet that is the conversation that's being held.
Great. All right. I'm using my moderator's prerogative to ask one last question because I think it's important for all of us here, given the overwhelming and often almost soul-crushing nature of some of these topics. I want to ask about the ways you personally remain resilient and potentially optimistic in light of the work you do, or do you not? And if you could draw from that to explain what can be done for those of us as individuals to try to connect our concern with action. Too big? We can skip it.
I would just say, when I'm interviewing someone who has gone through something traumatic, perhaps 15 minutes of our conversation is about that traumatic event, and the other hours are about other stuff. It's about what they're doing and what their conception of where they're going is, and if they're going to go reunite with family, who that family is, and what their ideas of U.S. law are, and what they're good at cooking, and whatever they want to talk about. I think that, it's important to talk about uncomfortable events that people have gone through, and sometimes they don't want to talk about it that much. Sometimes if they've gone through, sexual traumas, that is going to be a brief conversation because maybe they're not prepared to go into that conversation, and maybe I'm not prepared to go into that conversation with them either. And so we can talk about it, but also I love my job. I get to talk to people who I would otherwise never have the opportunity to be in contact with and learn so much from them. And that's such a gift. And I think that, the thing that I walk away from each day of interviewing with is a lot of questions about how to frame a story or what are the most important things that people told me. But I don't think that I sit there in bed at night and think about exactly what their traumas are. Maybe I think also, the very valiant people who go work in situations of conflict, who are perhaps war photographers or who go and live in particularly brutal neighborhoods in Central America, have to have a different proximity to that violence such that they can't erase some of those images from their minds. And I think every person has to make a decision about how willing they are to be proximate to that violence. For me, that meant that I work in Mexico. I don't work in El Salvador. I'm one country away from the exact hardship that people are fleeing. And I'm doing a process of documentation that is a lot more about their uprooting and their transit and the ways that they are sort of ping-ponged between different cities and between different governments, rather than about exactly the harm that they are facing in their daily life, and rely more on them to explain that harm to me rather than being a direct witness to it, and that's a choice.
I'm glad you used the word proximate because what is the Brian Stevenson book, Mercies? At any rate, say again? Just Mercies, where the point that he makes is that you can only care about something if you're proximate to it. that the further you get away from it, the easier it is to be disinclined to even consider it. And so I feel that I get myself as close as I can tolerate it. Sometimes I get a little too, and then everybody needs to kind of fluff me back up, and I back up and start again. And I think that my pursuit of joy in my work is daily, and that I, to this day, continue to have a daily dose of joy. But I would have to say I'm grateful to my friends who are also there shoveling sand against the tide, and to faith, you know, to my own religious community.
Yeah. I consider myself very fortunate to be working in a place where I work with survivors of the Holocaust and survivors of other mass atrocities, and they have such resilience. I've been through nothing like that, and so I feel like seeing their strength is an inspiration to me. I think it's really difficult working in this field. You know, I work on genocide prevention, and it's hard to know when we succeed, and it's very obvious when we fail. And the failures are so visible and so human and traumatic and devastating. So every now and then when you get this glimpse of something going well, you grasp it and you remember it. On another panel, I was speaking about the case of Hissene Habre, who was a dictator in Chad in the 80s, and killed people, tortured people, raped people. It was devastating violence. There was a group of individuals, including one man who was a torture survivor, who fought for justice for over 20 years with others, with lawyers and with activists, journalists and others, who made sure that the quest for justice would not be elusive. The world, I don't think, knows a lot about Chad. A lot of people don't know the name Hissene Habre, and that's the name of the dictator. The name of the torture survivor is Suleiman Gengeng. He should be a household name because of his bravery. So it's people like that who have fought for so long, and then to see Habre be tried, have to answer for his crimes in front of his survivors, and to end up in prison is, I think, a small bright point, seeing the long, hard work and knowing that there's something that we could do to support those kinds of efforts in the long run. I think you have to grasp onto those things and remember how important they are for other people.
Stephen, could I just ask you to be kind of brief? Sorry.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. I really just wanted to echo what Andrea was saying about the resilience of people, and that's what keeps me going. You know, if I'm feeling overwhelmed or burnt out or just kind of sated or just kind of numbed or something like that, I recognize that, you know, I can hop on a plane and leave, right? I could you know, walk away, but most people can't, and so that just always keeps me driving forward, and the need to always to remain sensitive and to keep feeling, right, and not to numb it or turn it off. So, yeah.
Thank you all for sharing those personal thoughts. So far and away, the most frequently asked question here has been about the impact of climate change on migration and genocide, an enormous and growing point of concern. But would any of you be willing to take a stab at explaining where you see those intersections and the future of the issue?
I think climate change it's a really important issue to take into account when we see mass violence. I would stress, though, that it's one element. It can be a destabilizing element in a place. Climate change affects many communities, many countries. When you have mass killings or genocide, things of that nature, that's extremely rare. So there are ways to respond to climate change in a way that doesn't amplify its harm. But it's certainly, if there are other elements of government misrule, of a hatred for minority groups, I guess a poor human rights record, if you add the devastating effects of climate change to all of that, you can see the greater potential for mass violence. And there's a lot more research being done in this space to understand the exact connection. But if you look at situations like Syria, where environmental concerns did exacerbate the tensions that, of course, have resulted now in almost 250,000 people being killed. And so it's one element, but I would say it's not indicative. There isn't, again, that causal line between climate change and mass violence. When perpetrators decide to commit crimes against humanity, it's because they're choosing to do so. And maybe climate change has resulted in different kinds of demands on a population. But it's important to remember that when people are choosing to commit crimes, they're not doing it just because of these natural events that are happening around them. They're making the deliberate decision to act in that way.
I would say also, the U.S. as a country, if we look at that as like one example, is really not prepared to concede that it would receive people displaced by climate change. And, the closest thing we might have seen, again, returning to the example of temporary protected status, is after like a major weather event, like after the 1998 hurricane that like flattened Honduras, that those people were not deported immediately. We look at extreme examples rather than looking at overall trends. I would also say, a lot of people will tell you about the way that their corn crops or their African palm crops have been affected by climate change. They'll also tell you about things like the fact that coffee prices plummeted worldwide, and so that crop is also not sustainable. And so you have to sort of look at the intersection of global economics and climate change. I would recommend, there's a 4-part series that just came out by Jonathan Blitzer in The New Yorker that looks specifically at the issue of climate change in Guatemala and the ways that people who are deported just end up coming back because they can't stay, because their families have debt after many years of trying to migrate. And so those factors are all compounded. But I would say I don't know what's going to happen because, it's still so hard to try to have a asylum system concede that someone who has been directly persecuted in ways that are very visible should be protected, so that things that are harder to, where there's not like a political actor like the state that you can place blame on, but rather just the broader thing that is climate change, and that makes it much more harder for governments to concede that they have a responsibility there, even though we know that some countries are more responsible than others, for example, to contributing to climate change.
And I think we have such strong examples to focus on. I mean, I think if we pay attention to Brazil at all, I think the intersection of the effects of climate change, global economics, migration, racism, that someone who was engaged in the junta is now back. All these many years later, Brazil will be very interesting to watch. If we're really interested in seeing what's going to happen at a collision of all these forces, my sense is that's going to be one of the places.
Just, I'm glad actually that you mentioned the piece in the New Yorker, because it's really addressing how people in the Guatemalan highlands have been very affected by climate change, and that's how that's led to migration. But not that I'm a numbers guy and care so much about the statistics, but I have read, I think it was the IOM, International Organization on Migration, predicted that by 2050 there would be somewhere about 200 million climate refugees.
Right.
Yeah. So that's huge.
All right. I had another question asking to follow up a bit on the status quo versus the future. And some were wondering if the idea of refugee camps remains a valid approach to, and I mean the United Nations and others have acknowledged that it's not the preferred method, but they wanted you to comment on whether using camps for refugees and other sorts of centers for other migrants works. And is this a sustainable approach? Why or why not?
I think it depends what you mean by works. I mean, nothing's
works for the refugee.
Works for it's really difficult because there are so few good options. When you don't have the possibility to live safely in your own country, and that's normally people's preferred option, if that is no longer on the table, then fleeing to another place, often in these refugee camps where they are receiving some assistance, that might work on a temporary basis if they are receiving adequate assistance, access to healthcare, education, and the like. As you can imagine, the needs for a displaced population in that kind of setting might outpace the kind of services that are able to be provided, especially when those services rely on international donor support. I think the option of resettlement, again, is a very long process. I have friends who are in the resettlement process. I mean, some people, it took them decades to arrive to places like Australia or the United States. So sustainable? No. Is it working? No. But it's hard to think of really good options. Sometimes we try to promote more integration within the host community. And instead of being in a camp, can people be more integrated into that second country, especially when it seems unlikely that they will be able to return home soon? A lot of that depends on the policies and the will of that host country.
It always gets dark just before you die.
Oh my God.
Things have taken a turn.
So I think, it is, again, a tall order, but, promoting prevention or quickly stopping perpetrators from committing these crimes that are forcing people to leave in places where it's criminal activity forcing people to flee, I think that's the best way, because there really are no good options once people are forced from their homes.
Or leave.
Right, do you have any- Okay. So I think it's time for the last question. This question asker wants to know, how do we in the United States best welcome and integrate refugees into their new homes? Have you seen, any of the four of you, best practices in local American communities for welcoming the limited number of refugees we have welcomed?
I work in Mexico, not the U.S., and perhaps not the best person to answer this question. I would say I read about an interesting model in Canada whereby various families can act as the sponsor for a refugee family, which is a system we don't have in the U.S., such that you would have some sense of responsibility to someone who is not your direct family member. And I think that that's an interesting model to try to consider. But I would also say that there are a lot of refugees all across the U.S. that we don't know about, and it's always fascinating to me when I meet people from different cities in the U.S. who work on refugee issues to hear about who lives in their communities, and I'm constantly surprised. I went to San Diego a couple weeks ago and was learning about that, and it was stunning to me, and I met an Afghan family in Tijuana the other day, and their family is all in Buffalo, New York, and I'm from New York, and I had no idea that there was this Afghan population there. And so I think that the more that you can learn about it, the better it can be. And then if you are, for example, willing to learn another language, you can be a court translator, so not a translator, but rather someone who's assisting rather in various processes for people who are going through legal issues. You can also go to your local community centers and ask about who are the immigrants who are around, and can you plan as a community to be more welcoming. I assume in some ways that every community is different, and so that has to be a more local conversation perhaps.
I'll just mention very briefly that the city of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, I would suggest would be a good model, a place to look to in terms of how they've resettled refugees, that they're very welcoming. It's been partly the religious community there, but also the city itself at large. And probably way too many details to go into at the moment, but it's just put it into a little bookmark and check out what they've done.
And that I think also, there are certainly a lot of examples where it wasn't done well in this country, and yet with enough time, the communities have come to interface. I think about the Hmong and the Vietnamese in South Texas, where they had to bring in the Southern Poverty Law Center because they were burning up people's shrimping boats. And yet, if you look at those communities now, they're very integrated, and 25 years is a long time to look at something, but then in the course of humanity, 25 years is really nothing. So I think humanity prevails. People prevail in a community where they at least can have a standing. I always remember Jim Kim saying it's not that the poor want us to be poor with them. They just want us to get out of their way so that they don't stay poor.
Well said. Yeah.
Anything?
I think it was well said. Yeah, thanks.
All right, well, that does feel like an appropriate stopping point. I want to thank all our panelists, all our CWA volunteers. And all of you. Have a wonderful remainder of your 71st, or not your 71st, but the 71st conference on world affairs. Good day.